Imagine standing in the middle of a medieval town square. Around you, the marketplace hums softly, the clatter of wooden wheels, the shuffle of leather shoes, the murmur of barter and trade. In the very center lies the most essential piece of infrastructure, the well. To us today, it's just a stone-lined hole in the ground. But to the people of the Middle Ages, it was the lifeline of their community. It gave water for drinking, for brewing ale, for cleaning, and for cooking. Without it, no settlement could last more than a handful of days. And yet, when archaeologists peer into those same wells centuries later, what they find is rarely just water. Instead, the bottom of medieval well often looks more like a time capsule, filled with objects that don't belong there, each carrying quiet clues about the ordinary people who lived and died above them. In the Middle Ages, a well wasn't only a source of water. It was also a place of constant human activity. Children gathered there with wooden buckets. Women carried yokes across their shoulders. Men shouted instructions as carts rumbled by. In all this movement, things slipped, cracked, or fell. A ceramic jug, once precious, could tumble from someone's hand and shatter at the bottom. A knife, worn smooth from years of cutting bread, might be lost forever when it clinks out of sight into the water below. Over time, wells became silent repositories of these accidents, but they also became deliberate dumping grounds. Broken tools, unwanted pots, and even the remains of meals, bone shells, or spoiled produce all made their way into the water. Town councils often struggle with this, trying to regulate wells as clean sources of life, while villagers quietly treated them as convenient trash pits. This dual role explains why archaeologists uncover such peculiar collections of objects at the bottom of wells. To a medieval villager, the well was both sacred and ordinary, both life-giving and disposable. Consider one excavation in England. Deep within the stone shaft, archaeologists uncovered a set of children's shoes, their leather laces still faintly intact after hundreds of years in the damp. Next to them lay fragments of pottery, some glazed and dull green, others left rough and unfinished. A small pewter spoon lay bent at an angle, as if someone had tried to mend it before giving up and tossing it in. In another town, a well yielded something stranger still. The skull of a horse, carefully placed at the bottom, as though it were a deliberate offering. Was this an accident? A superstition? Or a quiet ritual performed by people whose names are long forgotten? Historians still debate whether such finds represent practicality, a way of disposing of dead animals, or deeper spiritual beliefs, like placing a guardian spirit beneath the settlement's water supply. Other discoveries are surprisingly mundane yet revealing. Combs carved from bone, pins made of brass, broken keys, cracked spinning wheels used for making thread. Each object tells us that medieval life was full of loss, replacement, and adaptation. To lose a comb might be inconvenient. To drop a key could mean a ruined door or chest. Yet into the well they went, where centuries later we rediscover them, puzzled by their presence. To fully understand these strange finds, you need to imagine how wells fit into everyday life. They weren't quiet places. At dawn, the first villagers gathered there, pulling up the day's fresh water before the line grew long. Buckets swung, ropes creaked, and gossip spread. Who had married, who had fallen ill, who had angered the local lord. Children often played around the well, and so small objects, marbles, wooden toys, or bits of cloth, slipped down. Women balancing heavy loads sometimes dropped fragments of clay jars. Blacksmiths or merchants might wash their hands nearby, accidentally losing tools or trinkets into the depths. And then there were the intentional drops. Wells, like rivers, carried symbolic weight. Water was life, but also mystery. To throw something into a well could be an act of sacrifice, a prayer for health, or a gesture to rid oneself of bad luck. This explains why coins are sometimes found among the rubble, the medieval equivalent of wishing into the water. Every object at the bottom of a medieval well represents a story, though most will never be fully told. A shoe without its pair hints at a child who returned home barefoot. A cracked jug suggests a housewife sighing at her loss. A bent spoon tells us of someone poor enough to try mending it before finally discarding it. These are not the grand narratives of kings and battles. They are the quieter, slower stories of human persistence. Yet the well itself remains silent. Its stone walls kept the town alive for generations. And then, when it was abandoned or covered over, it sealed away those stories until modern hands pried them open again. The most intriguing part is not just what was found, but what was chosen to be left. Some items suggest ritual, some accident, and some necessity. But all of them remind us that even the most ordinary acts, fetching water, carrying tools, discarding waste, create traces that survive for centuries. So when you picture a medieval well, don't see only a hole filled with water. Picture instead the quiet layering of objects, a spoon, a shoe, a shard of pottery, each resting one atop the other, waiting for centuries until they whisper their stories again. And yet, one question lingers. Were all these objects simply accidents of daily life, or do they point to hidden rituals and forgotten beliefs buried with them? If Section 1 showed you the well as an accidental museum, Section 2 takes you deeper into the world of beliefs, rituals, and deliberate choices that explain why so many peculiar things ended up at the bottom. Because not everything found in a medieval well was lost by chance.
For medieval people, water wasn't simply a necessity. It was also a symbolic threshold. Wells were mysterious places, dark, deep, echoing shafts into the earth. They gave life, yet they were also dangerous. A child leaning too far could slip in. A bucket might vanish into the depths with a hollow splash. No one could see what lay at the bottom. It was this combination, life-giving but unknowable, that gave wells their almost spiritual weight. To many villagers, they weren't just holes in the ground. They were portals between the human world and the hidden forces beneath. And when people believed a well could connect them to unseen powers, they used it for more than just drawing water. Archaeologists have long puzzled over why certain objects appear again and again in wells. Coins, for instance, are remarkably common. The explanation seems simple. Just as today you might toss a coin into a fountain for luck, medieval people made similar gestures. They dropped small offerings, not to entertain themselves, but as acts of hope or protection. But coins weren't the only offerings. In some wells, skeletons of animals, dogs, horses, or even smaller creatures, have been found placed carefully at the bottom. In one German excavation, a dog's remains were discovered arranged almost ceremonially, suggesting the villagers had lowered it intentionally rather than simply throwing it away. Was the animal meant as a guardian spirit for the water supply? Or was it part of a local superstition, a way to bless the well? Even more striking are the human remains occasionally uncovered. Some wells in Britain, when excavated, revealed skeletons of people who had been dropped inside. Were these victims of violence, hastily disposed of in a convenient pit? Or were they sacrifices tied to older, pre-Christian customs that lingered quietly in village traditions? The line between ritual, crime, and practicality is often blurred. To the medieval villager, superstition was not something separate from life. It was woven into it. If your child was sick, perhaps the water spirit was angry. If a drought came, perhaps the well needed a gift. These ideas weren't officially sanctioned by the church, but they persisted all the same. That explains why objects like amulets, beads, or charms sometimes show up in wells. These were not lost trinkets. They were deliberate deposits, meant to appease or protect. Some were simple carved stones. Others were fragments of jewelry that had already been worn thin but still carried symbolic value. It's easy for us to dismiss such practices as superstition. But for people who lived in a fragile balance with hunger, disease, and uncertainty, these gestures carried enormous weight. Dropping a small object into the well was not wasteful. It was an investment in survival. Wells also took on significance during war. Imagine a besieged town. When enemy forces cut off supplies, the well became the most vital point of all. To poison or block, it meant certain death for those trapped inside the walls. Archaeologists sometimes find weapons and armor inside wells: swords, daggers, arrowheads. Were these thrown in deliberately to deny them to the enemy? Or were they casualties of a chaotic battle, discarded in desperation? One striking example comes from a castle excavation where a well was filled not just with weapons but also with household goods, cooking pots, tools, even fragments of furniture. The theory is that when the fortress fell, defenders dumped everything into the well to deny their conquerors the use of clean water. In that sense, the well became both a symbol of life and a weapon of resistance. What makes wells so fascinating is that they held a double meaning. On one hand, they were practical tools. Fetch your water, wash your clothes, draw your bucket. On the other, they were symbols of depth and mystery. Writers of the time often used wells as metaphors, for wisdom, for secrets, for the unknown. This symbolic role may explain why objects tied to storytelling or identity sometimes appear at the bottom. Broken combs, for instance, weren't just tools. They could carry personal or symbolic significance. A discarded shoe wasn't only leather, it was a trace of the person who wore it. In placing such items in the well, people might have been making gestures to mark transitions, the end of a life, the closing of a season, or the hope for renewal. When you think of a medieval well, don't just picture it as a hole in stone. Picture it as the collective memory of the town. Each object, from a bent spoon to a horse skull, became part of that memory. The villagers might never have thought about it consciously, but over decades, the well accumulated stories, some ordinary, some extraordinary. The archaeologists who later uncover these layers act almost like listeners to an old conversation. Each fragment is a sentence, each broken pot is a phrase. Together, they form a strange, fragmented story of life that was never meant to be recorded, but somehow was, sealed in the dark, damp shaft of stone. So the next time you imagine a medieval well, see it not only as a water source, but as a stage where ritual, superstition, survival, and memory all mingled together. And yet, a question remains. What do these discoveries truly tell us? Are they evidence of a shared belief system, or simply the scattered remains of daily survival disguised as ritual? If the first section revealed wells as accidental museums, and the second exposed them as stages for ritual and belief, then this final section shows you what they have become today, windows into forgotten lives. Because for historians, archaeologists, and even casual readers like you, the strange objects at the bottom of wells are not just curiosities, they are evidence. They tell us what people wore, what they ate, what they believed, and what they valued. And perhaps most importantly, they tell us about the things people never intended to record. Most of history, as it was written in chronicles or preserved in archives, concerns the grand, kings, queens, battles, treaties. But the fragments from wells shift the focus. They show us that history is also in the small, unremarkable objects. A cracked pot says more about daily cooking than a royal feast ever could. A child's shoe, left waterlogged at the bottom, tells us more about family life than a cathedral's stained glass. A bent spoon speaks to repair, reuse, and the stubborn refusal to waste. Wells remind us that ordinary people left behind extraordinary records, not in parchment or marble, but in lost objects that survived precisely because no one thought them worth saving. When archaeologists draw up buckets of mud and sift through them, they are not simply cataloging objects. They are reconstructing stories. Each fragment is an anchor to a life once lived. For example, when multiple shoes of different sizes are found together, researchers can speculate. Was this the loss of an entire family's footwear? Did a shoemaker discard flawed goods? Or were these items placed deliberately, perhaps as part of a closing ritual when the well was sealed? Similarly, when multiple coins from different reigns appear, it raises questions about continuity. Did generations of villagers drop them in for luck? Was the well a long-term site of superstition? Or were the coins simply swept in with debris over time? In every case, the objects demand interpretation. They force us to imagine, carefully, cautiously, the ordinary gestures of people whose voices are long gone. At their heart, wells were communal spaces. Everyone needed water. This meant that rich and poor alike gathered there, side by side. Few other places in medieval life blurred social divisions quite so completely. That's why the mix of objects is so revealing. A pewter spoon, accessible to the lower classes, might lie next to a fragment of fine imported pottery, owned by wealthier households. A child's wooden toy might rest near a blacksmith's iron tool. These juxtapositions remind us that life in the village was a shared fabric, stitched together by necessity. The well itself, standing at the center of town, embodied this truth. It was a point of connection, both practical and symbolic. Eventually, many wells were abandoned or sealed. Sometimes this happened when settlements shifted. Other times, it was due to contamination or collapse. But the closure of a well often became a symbolic moment. In some cases, the final objects found in wells appear almost like deliberate, closing deposits, a last gift to mark the end of its use. a broken pot placed carefully at the bottom, a coin resting alone, even animal remains, suggestive of ritual closure. These acts remind us that medieval people didn't simply move on. They marked endings, often in ways we can still detect centuries later. For us, the study of medieval wells is not just about cataloging strange finds. It is about recovering the forgotten layers of human experience. Each object forces us to think about resilience, the way people endured poverty, loss, and uncertainty with small gestures, repairing spoons, reusing shoes, dropping tokens into water when they had no other hope. It is easy to look at these fragments and dismiss them as trash. But in their persistence, they become something more, a testimony. They remind us that history is not only the story of rulers and wars. It is also the story of someone who bent down, filled a bucket, and in that act, lost or placed something that would outlast them by centuries. So when you hear of archaeologists pulling shoes, bones, or bent spoons from a medieval well, don't imagine only the objects themselves. Imagine the hands that touched them, the daily routines that carried them, and the whispered hopes or weary sighs that accompanied their fall into the dark water. Because in the end, medieval wells were not only lifelines for their communities. They became, unintentionally, repositories of memory, sealing away the most ordinary traces of human existence and offering them back to us centuries later as fragile but powerful reminders. And perhaps the deeper question lingers still. When future archaeologists dig through the remnants of our own time, what ordinary objects will they find? And what stories will they imagine about us? When you picture the grandeur of ancient Rome, you probably imagine marble temples, glittering mosaics, or senators draped in spotless togas. But beneath all that elegance lay a surprisingly messy question. How did Romans actually keep their clothes clean?
The answer begins not in the palaces of emperors, but in the ordinary backstreets of the city, in small workshops that dealt with one of the most thankless but necessary trades of the ancient world. The fullers. Fullers, known in Latin as full ones, were the professional launderers of Rome. While wealthy citizens sent their clothes to be cleaned, ordinary Romans also relied on them to keep tunics and cloaks presentable. Fullers worked in small shops scattered across the city, where large vats of water, brushes, and wooden frames filled the space. The process was not glamorous. First, garments were soaked in vats filled with water, clay, and other cleansing agents. Workers would then stomp on the clothes with their feet, much like treading grapes for wine, to loosen dirt and oils. This wasn't a quick dip and rinse. It was hard labor, hours of stamping, until the fabric was ready to be rinsed. Once washed, the clothes were stretched onto wooden frames to dry, beaten with brushes, and sometimes treated with sulfur fumes to brighten the fabric. The result was a tunic or toga that looked, at least temporarily, refreshed. But there was one key ingredient in Roman laundry that might surprise you: urine. Yes, you read that correctly. Urine was one of the most effective cleaning agents available in the Roman world. Why? Because it contains ammonia, which is excellent at breaking down grease and dirt. Romans recognized its value early on and collected it from public urinals or chamber pots. In fact, urine became so essential that Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on its collection in the 1st century CE. The so-called urine tax, vectigal urini, meant that fullers, who relied on it for their trade, had to pay fees. When Vespasian's son Titus criticized the practice, the emperor held a coin from the tax under his nose and asked whether it smelled. "Money doesn't stink," he declared, a phrase, pecunia non olet, that still survives today. So the next time you picture a pristine Roman toga, remember, its brightness might have depended on a bucket of recycled ammonia. In Rome, clean clothing wasn't just about hygiene. It was a marker of social status. Togas especially, those great heavy drapes of white wool, were meant to be dazzlingly clean, a visual statement of Roman order and discipline. To appear in public with a stained or dingy garment was not simply unfashionable. It was seen as disrespectful. This meant the fullers played a surprisingly important social role. They were low-status workers, yet the appearance of senators, merchants, and even soldiers depended on them. In this sense, Rome's laundry trade became a quiet but essential part of the city's machinery. All of this, however, came at a cost. The smell. A fuller's workshop was not a pleasant place. Between the vats of fermenting urine, the heavy wet cloth, and the sulfur fumes used for bleaching, the air was thick with stench. Roman writers often mocked the trade, joking about the foul odor that clung to fullers. Yet, despite this reputation, the shops thrived. After all, Rome was a city of more than 1 million people at its peak, all of them wearing, sweating in, and soiling their garments daily. Someone had to keep the city presentable, and that someone was the fuller. If you were to step into a Roman fuller shop, you'd likely hear the rhythm of stomping feet as workers trampled garments in the vats. You'd see men bent over tubs, rinsing fabric, and others hanging clothes on wooden racks. The air would sting your nose with ammonia, and above it all, the master fuller would supervise, keeping track of which garments belonged to which clients, for losing a senator's toga could mean trouble. The fuller's life was repetitive, dirty, and noisy, yet in its monotony, it provided stability. Fullers formed guilds, united by the shared burdens of their trade, and they even had religious dedications to Minerva, the goddess of crafts. This suggests that, while humble, the trade carried dignity for those who worked it. So the spotless white togas of Rome, symbols of civilization itself, were in fact a product of smelly workshops, buckets of urine, and endless stomping feet. And it leaves us with a lingering question. How did this unpleasant but necessary trade shape the rhythms of daily life in the empire? And what does it reveal about Rome's obsession with appearances? If Section 1 showed you the daily grind of the fuller's workshop, the stomping, the vats, and the stench, Section 2 steps back to reveal the larger system in which this humble trade operated. Because laundry in Rome wasn't just about cleaning clothes. It was a reflection of class, a source of revenue, and a quiet demonstration of power. For Romans, clothing wasn't just fabric. It was a uniform of identity. A senator's toga was not the same as a farmer's tunic. The toga candida, bright white and specially treated, was worn by political candidates, literally symbolizing their pure character. Soldiers wore sturdy wool. Slaves were marked by rougher cloth, and elites flaunted dyed or embroidered garments. In this world, laundry became a social necessity. A toga that looked dull or stained could undermine a man's reputation. A candidate appearing in public with a dingy robe risked whispers about his discipline and worthiness. Cleanliness wasn't just vanity, it was social proof.
That meant fullers weren't only cleaning garments. They were maintaining the visible lines of Roman hierarchy. They made sure senators looked like senators, priests looked like priests, and citizens stood out from slaves. Because clean clothes mattered so much, the laundry trade was big business. Workshops thrived in every city, sometimes clustering together in districts where the air was thick with ammonia. Archaeologists in Pompeii have uncovered several fullers' shops, complete with vats, basins, and wall paintings advertising their services. And while the work was lowly, it generated steady income. Wealthy families employed personal fullers, while ordinary citizens paid fees for regular washing. Clothes weren't disposable like ours today. A tunic or toga might last years, even decades. But to last that long, it had to be carefully maintained. That's where the fullers came in, repairing seams, brightening wool, and sometimes even re-dyeing garments. In this sense, they were both launderers and tailors, extending the life of every piece of clothing. One of the most famous intersections of laundry and politics was Emperor Vespasian's urine tax. When Vespasian came to power after the chaos of Nero's reign and the civil wars that followed, Rome's treasury was nearly empty. He needed money, and fast. Looking for creative revenue, he imposed a tax on something that seemed worthless: urine. Collectors set out jars at public latrines, gathering the fluid that fullers needed for their trade. The fullers, in turn, paid taxes to use it. The system was ingenious, if unappealing. The story of Vespasian holding up a coin to his son Titus and declaring, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't stink, became legendary. It showed the emperor's pragmatism, and cemented the fuller's trade as part of the empire's economic machine. This episode also reveals a Roman truth. No resource was too humble to tax, regulate, or profit from. Even waste became wealth in the hands of the state. Despite their lowly reputation, fullers organized themselves into guilds, collegia. These associations offered mutual support, collective bargaining, and even religious ceremonies. They often dedicated altars to Minerva, the goddess of crafts, or to Fortuna, goddess of luck. Guilds allowed fullers to secure legal recognition and protect their interests. In some cases, they even wielded political influence, especially in cities where the appearance of citizens depended heavily on their work. The existence of these guilds reminds us that Rome's economy wasn't just built on aristocrats and generals. It relied on organized labor, often dirty, smelly, and overlooked, but absolutely essential. Here lies one of the great ironies of Rome. The people who ensured the empire looked clean and civilized were themselves considered dirty and uncivilized. Fullers were often mocked in literature. They smelled of ammonia, they worked with waste, and they were associated with servile labor. Yet without them, the gleaming image of Roman order would have crumbled. This contradiction, despised workers doing indispensable jobs, tells us much about Roman society. It prized appearances, but it rarely acknowledged the invisible labor behind them. In this way, laundry was more than a chore. It was a mirror of Roman values, the obsession with status, the exploitation of humble workers, and the ability to turn even waste into profit. So the next time you picture Rome's spotless togas, imagine not just the senators wearing them, but the fullers stomping in their vats, the jars of urine hauled from public latrines, and the coins flowing into the emperor's coffers. And yet, one question lingers. If Rome depended so heavily on fullers for its image, how did these workers themselves see their role, as degraded laborers or as guardians of the empire's appearance? If Section 1 took you into the fuller's shop and Section 2 revealed the economic and political system surrounding it, this final section explores the cultural meaning of Roman laundry, how it shaped identity, how it lingered in ritual, and what it leaves us today. No garment embodied Rome's obsession with cleanliness more than the toga candida. Candidates for office wore these bright white robes, specially whitened with chalk or fuller's earth, to symbolize purity and honesty. The irony is obvious. Behind the gleaming cloth lay the sweat of workers stamping in urine vats. Yet to Roman eyes, the brilliance of the fabric mattered more than the process behind it. The toga was a costume of morality, projecting the image of order even when corruption lurked beneath. In this way, laundry became political theater. The fullers, working invisibly in the backstreets, were stagehands ensuring that Rome's actors could perform respectability in public. Though mocked for their smell, fullers had their place in Rome's religious and cultural life. Their guilds dedicated shrines, and some even held public banquets. Evidence from Pompeii shows painted advertisements for fullers' services, alongside images of gods and protective symbols. Why would such a humble trade claim divine support? Because laundry wasn't just about cleanliness, it was tied to purification. Just as sacrifices had to be made in clean garments, just as brides wore carefully prepared robes, so too the work of the fuller carried ritual weight. The very act of transforming dirty, sweat-soaked fabric into something bright again mirrored the Roman belief in renewal, of purging the impure to reveal what was proper beneath. Today, archaeologists uncover fullers' workshops in surprising detail. In Pompeii, for instance, the eruption of Vesuvius froze a fuller's shop in time. Stone basins, lead pipes, and even wall paintings describing the work survived. The layout tells us how workers moved, how garments were rinsed, and how tools were stored. Even more astonishing are the residues left behind. Microscopic traces of urine salts, sulfur compounds, and wool fibers still cling to the stone, silent witnesses to centuries of washing. These chemical ghosts remind us that history isn't always recorded in ink. Sometimes it lingers in the pores of a wall or the bottom of a vat. The obsession with clean clothing reveals a contradiction at Rome's heart. While citizens prided themselves on order and discipline, the burden of achieving that order fell on those considered dirty. Fullers, slaves, and workers in foul-smelling workshops made possible the illusion of civilization. This paradox remains familiar today. Even in our world of machines and detergents, laundry is still undervalued labor, often done invisibly. Rome's fullers were the first in a long line of workers whose toil kept society looking clean while leaving them themselves overlooked. In many ways, Roman laundry practices echo into the present. The use of ammonia-based cleaners, the importance of whiteness as a symbol of purity, even the business model of laundries as specialized shops, all these trace their lineage back to the stomping vats of Rome. And Vespasian's phrase, pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink, survives as a proverb, born directly from the fuller's trade. It is one of Rome's most enduring reminders that even the foulest materials can be turned into profit. So when you picture Rome, don't imagine only its marble columns and triumphal arches. Imagine also the fuller's shop, the stomping feet, the acrid smell, the endless rhythm of cleaning. Because without those workers, the togas of senators would never have gleamed, the candidates would never have shone, and the empire's proud image would have been stained. The strange truth of Roman laundry is this: the empire of marble was built on the labor of those who dealt with dirt. And perhaps the final question lingers: what does it say about a civilization when its greatest symbols of purity are made possible only through the dirtiest of labors? Imagine waking before dawn, not to the chatter of a city marketplace or the cry of livestock, but to the tolling of a bell in a stone monastery. The air is cold, the corridors dim, and the silence deep. Monks stir from their narrow beds, wrap themselves in plain robes, and shuffle toward the chapel for prayer. But as the chants echo in the choir, another part of the monastery is already stirring: the kitchen. Here, in the heart of the cloister, firewood is being stacked, pots arranged, and the first smells of the day begin to rise. The kitchen of a monastery was more than a place to prepare food. It was a space of devotion in itself. Every act, chopping vegetables, kneading bread, stirring broth, was considered part of the monk's obedience to God. Silence was maintained as much as possible, broken only by the crackle of firewood or the scrape of a ladle. For monks, cooking wasn't about personal taste or indulgence. It was about nourishment for prayer. Meals were designed to sustain the body just enough for the spirit to remain focused on higher things. Rich flavors, heavy feasts, and indulgent meats were avoided. Instead, the kitchen produced a steady rhythm of simple, repetitive foods. The first task each morning was to light the hearth. This was no small feat. Fire had to be carefully maintained from the previous day, and embers were guarded like treasure. If the coals died, the monks might need to fetch fire from a neighbor or strike sparks from flint, a slow, frustrating process. Once the flames caught, great cauldrons of water were set to boil. Bread dough, prepared the evening before, was slid into ovens heated by wood and stone. The smell of baking bread drifted through the cloister, a quiet reminder of the day's rhythm. For breakfast, monks rarely ate much, usually bread, sometimes with cheese, occasionally with weak ale or watered wine. Meat was almost never allowed, though fish might appear on certain days. Even this small meal was taken in silence, with readings from scripture accompanying the chewing. The ingredients of a monastery kitchen reflected its self-sufficient world. Most monasteries grew their own vegetables. Beans, onions, leeks, and cabbage were staples. Herbs from the cloister garden flavored the broths: sage, thyme, parsley. Salt was precious, used sparingly to preserve food. Grain was central: bread in many forms, porridge, and thick soups made from barley or oats. Dairy appeared in the form of cheese and butter, though fasting rules often restricted when these could be eaten. Eggs were common but carefully rationed. Everything was designed for endurance and repetition. Meals were filling but not extravagant, hearty enough to sustain long hours of labor in the fields or scriptorium. When the monks gathered for their first meal, silence was strict. Conversation was forbidden. Instead, one monk, the reader, stood at a lectern and read aloud from scripture or from the lives of saints. As the others ate, they listened, the crunch of bread mingling with the drone of Latin words. In this way, even the act of eating was transformed into part of devotion. The kitchen had prepared the food, the reader supplied the spiritual nourishment, and together they reminded the community that every action pointed toward God.
For the cooks themselves, kitchen duty was considered an act of service. Monks rotated through responsibilities, some days copying manuscripts, other days tending fields, and sometimes working in the hot, smoky kitchen. It was exhausting work, lifting pots, chopping vegetables, carrying wood, but it was also holy work, done in the spirit of humility. One medieval rule book even stated that monks who cooked should be given a few days of rest afterward, since the labor was so demanding. The kitchen was a place of sweat and silence, yet it carried the dignity of prayer. So when you picture a monastery kitchen, don't imagine clatter and chatter. Imagine instead the quiet shuffle of feet, the steady crackle of fire, the scent of bread rising in the air, and the conviction that every stir of the pot was itself a prayer. And yet one question lingers. How did this daily rhythm of humble cooking sustain not only the monks themselves, but the very survival of entire communities that relied on monasteries as centers of food, charity, and order? By late morning, the monastery kitchen was alive with activity. The morning fire, carefully coaxed from embers, had grown into a steady flame. Pots simmered, bread cooled on wooden racks, and the smell of herbs hung heavy in the air. The monks had already spent hours in prayer and labor, some in the fields, others in the scriptorium, and now the community turned toward the day's main meal. For most monasteries, the main meal of the day came around midday, after the labor of the morning and before the silence of the afternoon. This meal was more substantial than the morning bite of bread, though it was still modest by modern standards. Bowls of thick pottage, a stew of beans, peas, or lentils flavored with onions, garlic, and herbs were ladled out. Bread accompanied nearly every dish, baked daily from the monastery's grain stores. On fast days, the bread might be coarse, made with barley or rye instead of wheat. On better days, the loaves were lighter, though never extravagant. Sometimes fish, dried or salted, appeared as a protein source. Fresh fish, caught from rivers or ponds maintained by the monastery, was a prize addition. Meat, however, was strictly limited. According to the rule of St. Benedict, monks were forbidden to eat four-footed animals, except in cases of illness. This meant that pork, beef, and mutton were rare, reserved only for special occasions or medical necessity. Instead, eggs, cheese, and butter provided variety, though even these were sometimes restricted during the long fasting seasons of Lent and Advent. The result was a diet that was repetitive, filling, and profoundly shaped by religious discipline. Fasting was central to monastic life. It wasn't merely an occasional ritual. It was woven into the calendar. During Lent, Advent vigils before major feasts, and regular weekly fast days, the monks ate less and more simply. In practice, this often meant one main meal a day, with only bread or thin broth in the evening. Even on non-fasting days, meals were modest. Food was never meant to distract from prayer. The discipline could be demanding, especially during long winters when fresh vegetables were scarce. Yet monks believed that fasting purified both the body and the soul. Hunger became a form of prayer, a reminder that spiritual nourishment mattered more than physical satisfaction. But the monastery kitchen did not serve only the monks. One of its most important roles was hospitality and charity. Travelers, pilgrims, and the poor often came to monastery gates in search of food. Many monastic rules required that visitors be fed before anyone else, as though Christ himself were arriving in the form of the hungry stranger. The kitchen, therefore, maintained stocks of bread, ale, and simple stews that could be shared beyond the cloister walls. This generosity made monasteries vital to their surrounding communities. In times of famine, when crops failed or markets grew thin, the monastery stores of grain and salted fish often kept entire villages alive. The kitchen, in this sense, was not just the heart of the cloister. It was the lifeline of the region. Inside the monastery, meals were marked by silence and order. But outside, distribution to the poor was often noisy and chaotic. Travelers arrived weary from the road, villagers queued with empty baskets, and beggars waited in hopes of bread. Monks served patiently, their work considered an act of humility and devotion. This dual role, feeding both cloister and community, made the kitchen one of the most important centers of medieval life. It sustained not only prayerful monks, but also the fragile social fabric around them. And yet, behind the discipline and charity, the reality of the kitchen was hard labor. Every day was the same. Chop, boil, bake, clean, repeat. The menu rarely changed. Lentil stew, bread, fish broth, season after season. The cycle repeated with little variation. For the cooks, this monotony was its own spiritual challenge. To perform the same tasks daily without complaint was seen as an exercise in humility. The kitchen taught patience, endurance, and the art of finding meaning in repetition. So when you imagine a monastic kitchen at midday, don't see only the pots and bread. See also the discipline of fasting, the quiet endurance of cooks, and the lines of hungry strangers at the gate. And yet, one question remains. In a world of scarcity and hunger, how did monks balance their own vows of simplicity with the very real need to sustain those who depended on them? As the sun dipped low over the cloister walls and shadows stretched across the stone courtyard, the monastery kitchen prepared for its final duties of the day. The morning fire, once fierce, now burned low. Pots had been scrubbed, bread racks were empty, and the smells of herbs and broth lingered faintly in the air. The monks, weary from labor and prayer, gathered once more for their evening meal. Simple, quiet, and short. Unlike the more substantial midday meal, the evening supper was deliberately modest. Often it consisted of bread with a little cheese or butter, or a bowl of thin porridge made from barley or oats. On fasting days, even this might be reduced to dry bread dipped in water or broth. Silence still reigned, just as at midday, a reader recited from Scripture while the others ate, their heads bent low. Conversation was forbidden, laughter discouraged. The focus was not on the food itself, but on the humility of eating.
This quiet discipline underscored the monks' belief that the body was not to be indulged, only sustained. To eat was necessary, but it was never to become an end in itself. After the meal, the final work of the day began. The monks assigned to kitchen duties scrubbed pots, swept floors, and banked the fire so that embers would last through the night. Wooden spoons and ladles were hung neatly on pegs. The ovens cooled, their heat fading into the stone walls. The kitchen, once alive with clatter and steam, sank into silence. By the time the last monks left, only the faint glow of embers remained, like a heartbeat waiting for the next day. For the kitchen staff, this closing ritual was as important as the cooking itself. Order, neatness, and readiness for the morning were part of their devotion. The kitchen, like the chapel, had to be tended carefully, not for show, but for God. What the monastery kitchen taught, above all, was the discipline of limits. Food was never absent, but it was rarely abundant. Meals were predictable, repetitive, even dull. And yet, in this routine, monks learned patience, humility, and gratitude. The rhythm of cooking and eating became a form of meditation. Stirring the same pot of beans day after day reminded them that stability was a virtue. Kneading bread reminded them of labor. Even hunger, in fasting seasons, reminded them of dependence on God. In this way, the kitchen was as much a teacher as the library or the chapel. It shaped not only the body but the soul. Though humble, the monastery kitchen left a lasting mark on European history. Agriculture. Monks perfected crop rotation, fish ponds, and herb gardens, innovations that sustained communities and later spread across Europe. Hospitality. Monasteries became famous as places of refuge, where food and drink were offered to travelers regardless of status. Food culture. Many staples of European diet, cheeses, breads, brewing traditions, were refined and preserved within monastic kitchens. Charity. In times of famine, monasteries often fed entire villages, becoming lifelines for the poor. Thus, the quiet repetition of chopping vegetables and baking bread rippled outward into centuries of culture and survival. As night fell and the monks returned to prayer, the kitchen's work was done. Silence hung heavy in the stone halls, broken only by the rustle of robes and the echo of psalms. The fire smoldered, waiting for dawn. And in that silence lay a truth. The monastery's strength was not only in its chants or its manuscripts, but in the simple, faithful labor of its kitchen. Food sustained prayer, prayer gave meaning to labor, and together they built a rhythm that carried European monasticism through centuries. So when you picture a monastery, don't think only of stone cloisters and illuminated manuscripts. Think also of the kitchen, the steaming pots, the endless bread, the silence of meals. For it was here, in the quiet work of feeding, that monks not only nourished themselves, but preserved a culture of discipline, endurance, and charity that shaped Europe long after their fires burned out. And perhaps the question lingers, in our world of abundance and noise, what might we learn from the quiet humility of those who found prayer even in the stirring of a pot? Today, salt is something you barely think about, a shaker on your table, a pinch in your soup. But in the ancient and medieval world, salt was not a seasoning. It was a lifeline. Without it, food spoiled quickly, diets collapsed, and survival itself was threatened. For much of human history, salt was scarce, difficult to transport, and absolutely essential. Entire economies, wars, and empires rose and fell on the ability to control it. In some times and places, it was traded quite literally for gold. Salt did three things that made it priceless. Preservation. Before refrigeration, salt was the single most effective way to preserve food. Meat and fish salted heavily could last months or even years, sustaining armies, navies, and cities through winters and famines. Nutrition. Salt provided essential minerals. Without it, people risked weakness, cramps, and even death. Communities far from the sea especially depended on salt as their only steady source of sodium. Flavor. Even in austere diets, salt made food palatable. A pot of beans without salt was filling but joyless. With it, meals became tolerable. Because of these roles, salt became not just a trade good but a currency of survival. The Romans were among the first to organize a salt economy on a grand scale. They built roads specifically for transporting salt, one of which, the Via Salaria, gave its name to the trade itself. Roman soldiers were partly paid in salt allowances, a practice that gave us the word salary from salarium. To be worth one's salt was literally to be worth the cost of feeding. Without salt, armies could not march. Bread went stale, meat rotted, and morale crumbled. Thus, something as simple as white crystals shaped the very infrastructure of empire. Because it was essential and difficult to produce, salt was a perfect tool for rulers to control. Kings and emperors taxed it, guarded its trade, and used it to raise revenue. In medieval France, the hated gabelle, a salt tax, became one of the sparks of public anger leading to the French Revolution. In China, dynasties maintained state monopolies on salt for centuries, generating vast wealth. Even in Africa, salt caravans crisscrossed the Sahara, carrying great slabs of salt to trade for gold. In some markets, a pound of salt was literally exchanged for a pound of gold, not because of luxury, but because without salt, life could not continue. Imagine yourself in a medieval village. Your family slaughters a pig in autumn to prepare for winter. Without salt, the meat will rot within days. With salt, it can be preserved, smoked, and eaten slowly over months. Without salt, you risk starvation. With salt, you survive. Salt also entered daily rituals. It was sprinkled on bread, mixed into cheese, and even carried as a protective charm against evil. A spilled pinch of salt was thought unlucky, a superstition that lingers even today. Though necessary for all, salt was not equally available. The wealthy enjoyed it in abundance, using it to flavor rich foods and meats. The poor often struggled to obtain it, relying on small rations to stretch through the year. At medieval banquets, the placement of the salt cellar on the table indicated rank. Guests seated above the salt were of higher status, those below the salt of lower. Thus, even at the dinner table, salt marked social hierarchy. So when you picture salt in the past, don't imagine the shaker on your counter. Imagine caravans crossing deserts, Roman soldiers earning their salary, and kings taxing crystals as though they were treasure. Because in many times and places, salt was not just a flavor. It was the difference between hunger and survival, poverty and wealth, weakness and strength. And the question lingers: how did such a common substance become powerful enough to shape revolutions, trade routes, and empires? If salt gave life, then those who controlled it controlled survival itself. That truth made salt not just a kitchen staple, but a tool of political and economic power. Kings, emperors, and merchants alike turned salt into revenue, and sometimes entire wars were fought over it. Salt did not exist everywhere. Some communities had easy access to coastal salt pans or natural deposits, while others lived days or weeks away from the nearest source. This inequality created sprawling trade routes. Rome, the Via Salaria, carried salt inland from the Adriatic coast, feeding cities and armies. China, the state maintained strict monopolies on salt production, with caravans transporting it across provinces under heavy guard. Africa, great caravans crossed the Sahara, carrying slabs of salt on camelback to trade for gold in places like Timbuktu. Travelers described these slabs as heavy, gleaming bricks stacked high like treasure. Medieval Europe, salt mines in Salzburg, Lüneburg, and Wieliczka fueled the prosperity of entire regions, their names forever tied to salt. Salzburg literally means salt castle. Where salt flowed, wealth followed. Where salt was scarce, communities depended on these routes for survival. Few examples show the political weight of salt better than France's gabelle. Beginning in the 14th century, the monarchy imposed a mandatory tax on salt. Every family was required to purchase a certain amount each year, whether they needed it or not. The gabelle quickly became one of the most despised taxes in French history. It was uneven, punishing peasants while allowing the wealthy to avoid the burden. Smuggling salt became a common crime, and entire networks of faux-sonneurs, illegal salt traders, emerged. Centuries later, the anger over this unfair tax fed into broader resentment against the monarchy. By the time of the French Revolution, the gabelle symbolized everything ordinary people despised about royal oppression. Something as small as salt became a spark for revolution. In China, dynasties from the Han to the Qing recognized salt as a perfect monopoly. Unlike grain or textiles, salt was universally needed and relatively easy to regulate. The state seized control of production, built salt works, and taxed distribution. The revenue was enormous. In some eras, salt taxes provided as much as half of the empire's income. This money funded armies, infrastructure, and bureaucracies. Yet it also bred corruption, as officials skimmed profits and smugglers undermined the monopoly. Here, too, salt became a symbol of state power and state abuse. For centuries, control of salt was a way for rulers to hold their people in check. In West Africa, salt was so rare in some regions that it became as valuable as gold. Caravans of camels carried salt slabs from the mines of the Sahara southward, where they were traded in equal weight for gold dust. The cities that sat at the crossroads of this trade, such as Timbuktu and Gao, grew rich. Salt allowed empires like Mali to thrive. Kings and traders alike depended on this exchange, where survival was literally measured in ounces of crystal and flakes of metal. For villagers living far from the coast, a pinch of salt could transform their diet, turning bland millet porridge into something sustaining. Salt here was not luxury, it was necessity priced like treasure. Even England had its salt battles. During the 17th century, the crown imposed heavy taxes on salt, making it a major source of income. Smuggling flourished along the coasts, and enforcement often turned violent. The salt monopoly remained unpopular well into the 19th century, when reformers finally ended it. But for centuries, the humble act of salting a fish or preserving a piece of meat meant engaging with the reach of the state. Again and again, salt provoked rebellion. It was too basic to ignore, too universal to avoid. Unlike luxuries that only the rich could afford, everyone needed salt. Taxing it was efficient, but it also guaranteed widespread resentment. Perhaps the most famous modern echo of this came in 1930, when Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt March against British colonial rule in India. By breaking the British salt laws, which taxed even the collection of salt from the sea, Gandhi showed how something so ordinary could become a symbol of resistance.
Salt built roads, enriched kings, and toppled governments. It linked empires across deserts, oceans, and centuries. And yet, at its heart, it was never about wealth or politics. It was about the simple human need to eat, to preserve, to survive. And so we're left to ask, if control of salt could shape entire civilizations, what does that tell us about the quiet power of the most ordinary necessities? By now, you've seen how salt preserved food, fueled economies, and stirred revolutions. But salt was more than practical. Across cultures, it became a symbol of purity, loyalty, and even the sacred. In its tiny crystals, people saw something larger than survival, they saw meaning. In many traditions, salt was considered holy. The Hebrews used it in temple sacrifices, where offerings were seasoned with salt as a sign of covenant. In Christianity, baptismal rites sometimes included a grain of salt placed on the tongue, symbolizing incorruptibility and wisdom. In medieval Europe, priests blessed salt to be sprinkled in holy water. It wasn't just about cleansing the body, it was about cleansing the spirit. Salt purified, salt preserved, salt protected. Even today, in parts of the world, people sprinkle salt at thresholds to guard against evil or scatter on graves as a gesture of remembrance. Its crystals still carry echoes of their ancient spiritual weight. Salt left its trace in language. To be worth one salt meant to be valuable, a phrase that survives from the Roman soldier's salarium. The word salad comes from herba salata, salted greens. Even the word salary, which we now take for granted as a paycheck, carries a memory of Rome's salt allowances. Across cultures, salt became a metaphor for loyalty and trust. Sharing salt with a guest signified hospitality and protection. To betray the salt was to betray a bond of fellowship. These phrases linger, faint reminders of when salt was more than seasoning, when it was a very bond of community. At medieval banquets, the placement of the salt cellars symbolized hierarchy. Those seated above the salt were honored guests, while those below the salt held lesser status. Salt itself was often displayed in ornate containers, gleaming not only as a flavor but as a marker of prestige. This simple mineral, so common today, was once a sign of wealth and refinement. To have abundant salt was to declare abundance itself. Spilled salt has long been considered unlucky. Why? Because in a world where salt was precious, wasting it was more than carelessness. It was a sign of misfortune, to counter the bad luck. One tossed a pinch over the left shoulder, a habit still alive in kitchens today. Other superstitions surrounded salt. It could ward off witches, purify fields, and protect newborns. In Japan, salt was and still is sprinkled at sumo matches and outside homes to drive away evil spirits. In Eastern Europe, bread and salt together were offered to guests as a symbol of welcome and prosperity. Everywhere, salt was more than food. It was a charm against the fragile uncertainties of life. Today, salt no longer drives empires or sparks revolutions. It is cheap, abundant, and so ordinary that we hardly notice it. Yet its legacy lingers everywhere. In our language, our rituals, our kitchens. Think of how you season a conversation with wit or describe someone as the salt of the earth. These phrases come from a time when salt was essential to survival. And think of the table. Almost every meal in every culture includes salt. It remains the most universal of flavors, the one mineral that unites all cuisines, from the Sahara to the Arctic. So when you hold a pinch of salt between your fingers, remember what it once meant. Not just taste, but preservation. Not just food, but faith. Not just crystals, but currency. Salt was survival, power, and meaning, all in one. And perhaps the deeper question lingers still. If something so ordinary once carried such extraordinary weight, what other simple things in our own lives will future generations see as treasures? When you think of the Ottoman Empire, you might picture sultans in jeweled turbans, janissaries marching with muskets, or minarets piercing the skyline of Istanbul. Yet behind the spectacle of soldiers and palaces, the empire's survival rested on something quieter, less visible, but just as powerful: the bureaucracy. Empires do not run on sword alone. They run on ledgers, decrees, and lists. And in the Ottoman world, an army of scribes and clerks, men whose names rarely appear in history books, kept the machinery of empire turning day after day, decade after decade.
The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, ruling millions of subjects in dozens of languages. To govern such vastness required order on paper. Taxes had to be recorded, military registers maintained, decrees copied and distributed. This was the work of the scribes, catabler. Sitting at low desks with reed pens, they copied documents onto parchment or paper, their hands cramping as they filled page after page in careful calligraphy. Their task was not glamorous, but it was indispensable. Without them, armies went unpaid, taxes vanished into corruption, and orders from Istanbul dissolved before reaching distant provinces. The scribe's pen was as vital as the janissary's musket. One of the most striking symbols of this bureaucracy was the tugra, the ornate signature of the sultan, drawn in sweeping lines at the top of official documents. Every decree, every grant of land, every appointment bore this emblem, carefully executed by court calligraphers. It was both practical and symbolic, proof of legitimacy, but also a work of art. The bureaucrats guarded these documents fiercely, for to alter or forge a tugra was treason. This blending of paperwork and artistry reflects the Ottoman view that governance was not only administration, but ceremony. Even in bureaucracy, beauty mattered. How did one become a scribe in the empire? It began with schooling. Young men studied language, law, and above all, calligraphy. The ability to write beautifully was not just a skill, it was a mark of discipline and refinement. Promising students entered the scribal service, starting with menial tasks like sharpening pens, grinding ink, or carrying documents. Over years, they rose through ranks, learning to keep records, draft decrees, and manage the endless paper that flowed through the chancery. By the time they became full clerks, they were trusted with matters of enormous consequence, recording tax registers that shaped the empire's revenue, or copying military orders that determined the movement of armies. Unlike soldiers or merchants, the life of a bureaucrat was not full of travel or danger. It was life at a desk, long hours bent over documents, surrounded by shelves of records, with the scratching of pens as the daily soundtrack. The work was slow, repetitive, sometimes tedious. Yet it carried weight. A single error in copying could misdirect a decree or alter a tax record. Accuracy was everything. Many scribes developed reputations for precision, while others became infamous for corruption, manipulating records for bribes. Still, for most, the work was steady. It provided stability, respectability, and a career path in a world where many labored in fields or fought in wars. Though invisible in battles or ceremonies, the bureaucrats shaped the empire's daily reality. They decided who paid taxes and how much, which villages supplied soldiers, which governors received funds. In their ledgers, entire communities rose or fell. The scribe was not a warrior or a ruler, but in his ink-stained hands lay the quiet power of administration. So when you picture the Ottoman Empire, don't think only of swords, domes, and drums. Think also of the men at their desks, dipping pens into ink, drawing elegant letters by candlelight. For in those pages lay the empire itself, orderly, enduring, and fragile. And the question lingers, what does it mean when the survival of an empire depends not on its soldiers, but on the patience of its clerks? If the Ottoman scribe's pen was his weapon, then the ledger was his battlefield. Every line of ink represented money owed, land measured, or obligations recorded. And while the empire projected power through armies and sultans, its true strength lay in the paper trails left in chancery offices and provincial archives. The Ottoman bureaucracy revolved around records. To govern a vast, diverse empire stretching from Hungary to Arabia, officials needed to know who lived where, what they owned, and what they owed. This was the purpose of the Tahrir Defters, vast tax registers. Each book listed villages, households, land plots, and the taxes they generated. Scribes compiled these by traveling into the provinces, inspecting fields, and interviewing locals. The data was meticulous: the number of plows, the yield of wheat, the ownership of olive groves. Once completed, these ledgers allowed Istanbul to calculate revenue and distribute land grants to soldiers or officials. In many ways, they were the empire in miniature, written out in neat rows of ink. One of the key mechanisms of Ottoman governance was the timar system, a form of land tenure. Instead of paying soldiers directly from the treasury, the state granted them the right to collect taxes from a certain area of land. This system relied entirely on accurate records. The bureaucrats had to define the land, assess its productivity, and record who owed what. If a clerk erred or deliberately altered a record, the consequences rippled outward: peasants overtaxed, soldiers underpaid, and trust in the system shaken. Thus, a scribe sitting at a desk could determine whether a cavalryman had the means to arm himself, or whether a village could endure the year's burdens. The empire's cavalry charges began not in battlefields, but in ledgers. Unlike military conquest, which was loud and dramatic, bureaucratic power was slow, quiet, and relentless. Taxes flowed not once but year after year, every season bringing grain, coin, or livestock into imperial hands. The scribe's work ensured that this rhythm continued. Villages that failed to pay were recorded, investigated, and disciplined. Governors who skimmed taxes were noted, reported, sometimes dismissed. Nothing was as dangerous to an empire as disorder, and the bureaucrats' endless copying and checking was meant to prevent just that. It was slow work. It was dull work. But it was the glue of empire.
At the heart of this system stood the Divan-i Humayun, the Imperial Council. Here, grand viziers and high officials met under the authority of the Sultan. Yet behind their deliberations, teams of clerks copied decrees, recorded decisions, and dispatched documents across provinces. The chancery buzzed with controlled activity. Sealed scrolls left for governors. Tax registers were reviewed, and court scribes ensured every word matched the will of the Sultan. The physical flow of documents through the chancery mirrored the political flow of power through the empire. Though humble in status, bureaucrats often saw themselves as guardians of the empire's balance. Soldiers defended borders, yes, but clerks ensured that soldiers had pay, horses, and supplies. Governors enforced justice, but scribes tracked their authority and reigned in corruption. In many ways, the scribe was the empire's accountant, archivist, and quiet policeman, never visible in battle, yet always present in the daily grind of governance. To modernize, a crooked column or smudged line might seem trivial, but to an Ottoman clerk, a mistake could be catastrophic. A single misplaced digit could alter a village's tax burden. A miscopied decree could unleash confusion in a distant province. Thus, accuracy became almost a spiritual discipline. Calligraphy itself, graceful, precise, deliberate, reflected the ideal of bureaucratic order. To write beautifully was to govern faithfully. To copy carelessly was to endanger the state. So when you imagine the Ottoman Empire, Remember that his heart was not only in palaces and mosques, but in dusty offices where men hunched over ledgers, copying the empire into existence line by line. And the question remains, how much of history's great empires depended not on conquest or charisma, but on the patience of those who recorded the mundane details of daily life? If Ottoman scribes once seemed like faceless figures bent over paper, their true legacy only becomes clear centuries later. Empires rise and fall with armies, but they are remembered and understood through records. In that sense, the pen of the bureaucrat often outlives the sword of the soldier. The Ottomans preserved mountains of documents: tax registers, decrees, land records, court cases, marriage contracts. Many survive today in archives in Istanbul and beyond. For historians, these records are treasure troves. They reveal not only the decisions of sultans, but the lives of ordinary villagers, what crops they grew, what taxes they paid, even how disputes over goats or olive groves were settled. Without the meticulous work of bureaucrats, much of Ottoman history would be guesswork. Instead, we have details so fine that we can reconstruct the population of villages centuries gone. In their quiet labor, the scribes created a memory of the empire, what made the Ottoman Empire endure for more than 6 centuries. Military strength mattered, but armies cannot march forever. Palaces crumble, dynasties weaken, yet the bureaucratic machine carried on. Even in times of crisis, rebellions, wars, or succession struggles, the clerks continued copying, filing, and recording. This routine created stability. Subjects still paid taxes, governors still received instructions, soldiers still found their names in ledgers. The empire might shake, but the bureaucracy absorbed the shock. In this sense, the scribes were not only record keepers, they were custodians of continuity, holding the empire together through the sheer persistence of paperwork. For those who lived within it, Ottoman bureaucracy could feel heavy. Villagers resented endless taxes, officials complained of endless forms, and governors bristled under the constant watch of clerks. Bureaucracy was slow, demanding, sometimes suffocating. But this weight also gave the empire resilience. Every decree had to be copied, every order filed, every signature checked. It was tedious, but it was reliable. Empires without paper often dissolved into chaos. The Ottomans endured because their paper outlasted their crises. It's easy to see scribes as nameless functionaries, but many took pride in their work. Calligraphy was considered an art form, and some clerks rose to fame as masters of the pen. Their sweeping letters, used in official decrees and tugras, blended beauty with bureaucracy. In this way, Ottoman paperwork was not only functional, it was artistic governance, rulership expressed in ink and elegance. Even today, their documents are admired not only for their historical value, but for their beauty. The Ottoman system left deep marks on the lands it once ruled. Modern Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East all inherited administrative habits shaped by centuries of Ottoman record-keeping. Tax structures, land laws, even the notion of centralized archives trace their lineage to Ottoman bureaucrats. Though the empire fell in the early 20th century, its paper trails still organize property rights, family histories, and government systems today. So when you picture the Ottoman Empire, don't stop at its sultans or its soldiers. Picture instead the scribes in quiet rooms, copying ledgers late into the night. Their hands cramped, their ink smudged, their work unnoticed. Yet their patience outlasted empires. The soldiers' sword won battles, but the scribe's pen preserved memory. And perhaps the final question is this: which is a truer power, the conquest of the battlefield or the quiet endurance of the archive? In every medieval village, the mill stood as both landmark and lifeline. Its wooden arms caught the wind on the hill, or its wheel churned with the river's current, endlessly turning stone against stone. And at the center of it all was the miller, a figure both ordinary and essential, whose daily routines bound together the survival of his community. Bread was a staple of medieval Europe. To make bread, you needed flour, and to make flour, you needed a mill. Before mills, villagers ground grain by hand with heavy querns. Slow, back-breaking work. But the rise of watermills and windmills transformed village life. Now, one man and his machine could grind grain for dozens of families, turning the harvest into flour that fed entire communities. This made the mill not just a workplace, but a center of survival. Without it, no household could endure the winter. The miller's day began early, often before dawn. He inspected the millstones, massive discs of stone that needed constant care. Too rough, and they shredded the grain into dust. Too smooth, and they left the kernels unbroken. The balance was delicate, requiring endless adjustments with iron tools. Next, he checked the gears and wooden shafts, greased with animal fat to prevent wear. If the mill was water-driven, he inspected the sluice gate, controlling the flow of the stream. If wind-driven, he gauged the weather, turning the cap of the mill so its sails caught the breeze. Only then could the work begin. Villagers arrived with sacks of barley, rye, or wheat, each hoping their grain would be transformed into flour fine enough for bread. Inside the mill, the air was thick with flour dust. Wooden gears groaned, stones rumbled, and the entire building shook with movement. The miller shouted to be heard, his hair and clothes powdered white by the constant drift of flour. It was noisy, dirty, monotonous work, yet it carried a strange rhythm. The steady grind of stone on stone, the creak of timbers, the rush of water, or the hiss of wind. These sounds became the soundtrack of the miller's life. To the villagers, the sound meant food. The turning mill was the pulse of survival. When it stopped, hunger loomed. Milling was not only labor, it was business. The miller did not work for free. Instead, he took a portion of the flour as payment, often a fixed fraction of every sack he ground. This fee made him both necessary and resented. Many tales cast millers as cheats, accused of taking more than their due. Honest as a miller was a phrase often used with irony. Whether fair or not, the miller's reputation was one of suspicion. He dealt with everyone's grain, and in a world of scarcity, trust was fragile. Yet resentment did not diminish his importance. Love him or hate him, the village could not live without him. The miller's work never truly ended, but it followed the rhythm of the seasons. Autumn was busiest, when harvest filled his storeroom with grain to be ground. Winter was quieter but still steady, as families rationed flour for bread. Spring brought repairs to the mill, swollen rivers, and bursts of work. Summer was a time of maintenance, waiting for the next harvest. Through it all, the mill turned, season after season, year after year. The constancy of the mill gave shape to village life, a rhythm as steady as the turning of the seasons themselves. So when you picture a medieval village, don't think only of fields and cottages. Picture also the mill, the groaning stones, the dust in the air, the figure of the miller adjusting his gears. For in that unchanging routine lay the fragile survival of his community. And the question lingers, what does it mean to live a life where every day is the same, and yet every day sustains the world around you? The sound of the mill was a heartbeat of medieval village, but the man who kept it turning lived in a space somewhere between trust and suspicion. The miller's role was practical, but it was also profoundly social. He handled the community's food, controlled the flow of its flour, and set the pace of its survival. That gave him importance and enemies. Unlike the farmer or the shepherd, the miller did not own his product. He processed what others grew. His payment came in the form of a multure, a portion of every sack of grain brought to the mill. Typically, this might be 1/16th or 1/20th of the flour. To the villagers, this fee often felt steep, especially when harvests were thin. They watched the miller's hands carefully, suspicious of any gesture that might take more than his due. And yet, without his mill, they could not eat. The quernstones in their homes were too slow for large families. The community was trapped in a cycle of reliance and resentment, grinding away like the very stones of the mill. This uneasy relationship gave rise to a mountain of stories and jokes about dishonest millers. In medieval literature, millers are often portrayed as greedy, shifty, or sly. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales features a miller who cheats his customers and tells bawdy stories. Proverbs warn that a miller's bag was always a little heavier than it should be. Whether these tales reflected reality or not, they revealed the social tension that surrounded the miller. He was necessary but distrusted, central but mocked. To the common imagination, he was a man who always came out with more flour than he deserved.
Suspicion aside, many millers did grow wealthier than their neighbors. The constant flow of grain through their hands gave them opportunities to skim, bargain, or store. Even without dishonesty, the steady multure meant reliable income, season after season. This sometimes set them apart from other peasants. Millers might build sturdier houses, own more land, or wear better clothes. Their position gave them status, not noble, but above the poorest villagers. It also gave them resentment. In some places, millers were accused of hoarding flour in times of famine, or of favoring certain families over others. Whether true or not, the perception of advantage clung to them like flour dust. Despite this unease, the mill was also a meeting place. Villagers came with their sacks and waited their turn, sometimes for hours. Children played by the riverbank or in the fields while their parents stood in line. Gossip spread, deals were made, and news traveled on the flow of grain. The miller stood at the center of this social network. He heard the news of harvest failures, marriages, disputes, and deaths. His mill became both a workplace and a listening post, a place where the community spun its stories as surely as it ground its flour. In many regions, the mill was not owned by the miller but by the local lord. Villagers were often obliged by law to grind their grain at the lord's mill and nowhere else. This banal right ensured that the lord profited from every harvest. The miller, in this case, was both servant and overseer. He collected the grain, kept the stones turning, and enforced the lord's monopoly. This made him doubly resented, not only for his own fee but for the obligations he represented. And yet, he also bore the brunt of responsibility. If the mill broke, if the stones cracked, if the wheel froze in winter, it was the miller who faced the anger of villagers and lord alike. So the medieval miller lived a life of dust and suspicion, needed by all, trusted by few. His wealth set him apart, his work bound him to the community, and his reputation was ground down by endless tales of cheating. And yet the question lingers: was the miller truly dishonest, or was he simply the face of a system that turned necessity into resentment? The life of the miller may have been dusty, monotonous, and often mistrusted, but it was also central to the rhythm of medieval survival. When we step back, we see not only a man at his stones, but a figure who embodied the endurance of ordinary life, the slow, steady pulse that kept communities alive. Every day looked much the same. Grain arrived, stones turned, flour poured into sacks. The sounds never changed: the groan of the wheel, the grind of stone, the hiss of wind in the sails. The miller adjusted gears, lifted bags, scraped flour from corners. There were no triumphs, no grand victories. Only repetition. And yet, this very monotony gave the village its stability. Families knew the mill was always there, grinding grain into bread, season after season. In this way, the miller's life was not about glory but about continuity. His work was invisible until it stopped, and when it stopped, hunger appeared. Because of his peculiar position, the miller became a symbol in folklore and literature. Sometimes he was mocked as greedy, sometimes feared as cunning, sometimes respected as strong and independent. The image of the dusty man by his stones captured the imagination of poets and storytellers. In songs and proverbs, the miller represented both labor and trickery, both endurance and suspicion. He was a reminder that survival depended not on kings or knights, but on the unglamorous turning of wheels. Though the miller's routine seemed unchanging, mills themselves represented technological progress. Watermills and windmills were among the most significant machines of the medieval world, precursors to industrial technology. They harnessed natural forces to multiply human labor, grinding grain faster than any household could manage. In that sense, the miller stood at the edge of innovation. His work may have been ancient and repetitive, but the mill itself hinted at the mechanization that would one day reshape society. Many medieval mills have long since fallen silent, their wheels rotted, their stones buried in grass. Yet in villages across Europe, ruins remain: moss-covered millstones, broken sluice gates, towers with empty sails. These remnants are more than relics. They are reminders of a world sustained by repetition, where life was measured not in years but in sacks of grain, ground steadily day after day. And in the records of medieval towns, in tax ledgers, in legal disputes over broken gears or stolen grain, the miller's presence lingers still. Even in the archive, his dust has not entirely settled. So the unchanging routines of the miller were not meaningless drudgery. They were the quiet foundation of survival, culture, and memory. His life was dusty, suspicious, ordinary, and yet it was essential. Perhaps the final question is this. In our search for drama in history, do we overlook the true engines of endurance? The men and women whose lives, though repetitive, kept the world alive? When you imagine medieval or early modern Paris, you may think of cathedrals and marketplaces, bridges over the Seine, or narrow streets filled with chatter. But beneath those streets ran something less glorious, a hidden world of waste, water, and smell. The sewers of Paris were not the grand tunnels we picture today, engineered with stone and iron. For centuries, they were little more than open ditches, sluggish streams, and crude channels, carrying away the refuse of a city that never stopped growing.
Until the modern age, Paris had no organized sewer system. Waste from homes and workshops was dumped into streets or cesspits. Rain carried it slowly downhill into ditches, and eventually into the Seine. Some houses had primitive gutters, but more often residents simply tossed waste out of windows, sometimes with shouted warning, "Guard low, watch out for the water." The result was a city where filth was part of daily life. Streets reeked, and the Seine, though a source of water, became a floating stew of refuse. The smell of Paris was as much a part of its identity as its bells and markets. It is difficult for us, in an age of sanitation, to imagine how overwhelming these odors were. Human waste mingled with animal dung from horses and pigs. Tanneries dumped chemicals. Butchers poured blood. Dyers released vats of foul liquid. All of it seeped into the earth or pooled in open drains. For Parisians, this was normal. Smell was part of survival. People grew used to it, learned to ignore it, or masked it with strong herbs and incense. Perfume itself, so famously associated with France, developed partly as a defense against the overwhelming stench of cities. As the city expanded, authorities realized something had to be done. From the 14th century onward, Paris began building covered drains, primitive sewers that channeled waste underground. These were narrow stone tunnels, often little more than culverts. They helped, but only slightly. Many remained clogged, poorly maintained, or too small for the city's needs. Engineers of the time lacked the means to build comprehensive systems. Instead, the sewers developed piecemeal, a covered drain here, a gutter there. The result was a patchwork network that carried waste erratically, sometimes back into the very neighborhoods it was meant to clean. Through it all, the Seine bore the brunt. It was Paris's water source, its transport artery, and its garbage dump. People drew drinking water from it, even as butchers and tanners poured refuse directly into it. Fishermen cast nets into the same waters where human waste drifted. The contradiction was glaring, but solutions were scarce. To live in Paris was to accept the river both as life and as contamination. The Seine was the city's blessing and its curse. The sewer became more than just infrastructure. It became a symbol of Paris itself, vibrant, chaotic, foul, and enduring. Writers described its smells with disgust. Travelers noted them in journals, and locals accepted them as unavoidable. The underworld of the city reflected the struggles above. Disorder, survival, and the constant attempt to balance beauty with filth. So when you picture Paris in the Middle Ages, don't imagine clean cobblestones and sparkling rivers. Imagine instead the stench of waste beneath the streets, the sluggish drains, and the river carrying both life and decay. And the question lingers: how do Parisians endure this hidden world of smells? And what does it reveal about the uneasy balance between beauty and survival in great cities? The sewer wasn't just an underground ditch. It was a constant presence in daily life, shaping how Parisians lived, worked, and even how they thought about the body, the city, and God. For ordinary Parisians, filth was unavoidable. Open gutters ran down the middle of streets, carrying refuse and sluggish trickles. Residents navigated puddles of waste, balancing on raised walkways when they existed, or simply stepping through muck. Shoes wore out quickly. Clothing carried the smells of the street. Marketplaces buzzed with the scent of fresh bread, meat, and fish, but also the overwhelming odor of garbage underfoot. To live in Paris was to live with the sewer in your nostrils. Children played in alleys where waste pooled. Pigs rooted through garbage, serving as crude waste managers. Even the wealthy in their grand houses could not escape the smells drifting up from the streets below. The sewers also shaped health. With no proper separation between waste and water supply, outbreaks of disease were common. Dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses spread easily. The great plagues of the 14th century were not caused by sewers directly. They spread through fleas and rats, but the filth of cities made them worse. Rats thrived in waste-filled streets, carrying fleas that infected millions. Later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, when Europe began to understand the connection between sanitation and disease, Paris's sewers were seen as both a danger and an opportunity. Reformers argued that the health of the city depended on controlling its underground arteries. But progress was slow. In medieval and early modern thought, smell was not only unpleasant, it was moral. Many believed foul odors carried corruption, sin, or divine punishment. To inhale bad air was to risk illness or spiritual weakness. This idea, known as miasma theory, dominated for centuries. People thought disease spread through bad smells. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong. Foul-smelling places often did harbor disease. But the explanation was spiritualized, tying physical rot to moral decay. Thus, the sewers of Paris were not just seen as dirty. They were seen as evidence of disorder in both body and soul. Calls for cleaning the city were as much about morality as about health. Managing filth was a political matter. City officials tried to regulate waste disposal, issuing edicts about where garbage could be thrown, how streets should be cleaned, and who was responsible for drains. But enforcement was inconsistent. Streets clogged quickly, cesspits overflowed, and the Seine filled would refuse again and again. Cleaning was expensive, and few wanted to pay for it. Yet when the smells grew unbearable, especially in hot summers, citizens demanded action. Complaints about sewers appear again and again in city records, showing that filth was a constant political problem. Behind the scenes, there were those whose job it was to maintain the sewers. They shoveled muck, cleared blockages, and risked disease daily. These workers lived in the margins of society, often despised for their association with filth. Yet their work was essential. Without them, the city would drown in its own waste. They were the unseen backbone of Parisian survival, laboring in silence beneath the feet of kings and priests. So the sewer was more than a drain. It was a stage where health, morality, and politics collided. Every foul smell carried meaning, as a sign of disease, of sin, or of civic neglect. And the question lingers, how did a city so proud of its cathedrals and culture tolerate such filth beneath its feet? And what finally drove it to transform its sewers into something modern? For centuries, Parisians endured the smells, the disease, and the chaos of their makeshift sewers. But by the 19th century, the city began to change. The same tunnels that had once been symbols of filth slowly became symbols of progress. Paris built one of the most famous sewer systems in the world, but the path to it was long, slow, and messy. By the 18th century, reformers were calling loudly for change. Doctors warned of disease, citizens complained of unbearable smells, and engineers proposed new solutions. The real transformation began under Baron Haussmann in the mid-19th century, when Paris underwent massive urban renewal. Streets were widened, boulevards cut, and beneath them, new sewers were laid out. For the first time, the city had a coherent underground system, wide tunnels of brick and stone, carrying waste away efficiently. The old patchwork drains were replaced with a network designed for a modern city. The sewers became a point of pride, even a tourist attraction. Engineers guided visitors through the tunnels, showing off the system that turned filth into order. Writers like Victor Hugo used the sewers as metaphors. In Les Miserables, the Paris sewer is both a place of filth and redemption, a symbol of society's hidden struggles. What had once been shameful now became a marker of progress. Paris's sewers were no longer the city's curse, but its triumph. Even in the modernized tunnels, work remained harsh. Sewer workers waded through muck, clearing blockages and maintaining flow. But their work was better organized, more respected, and sometimes even celebrated. The stench never fully vanished. It couldn't. But compared to the open drains of medieval times, the new system was a revolution. Paris became healthier, cleaner, and prouder of its underground arteries. Yet even as the new sewers were built, memories of the old ones lingered. Travelers and reformers recalled the filth of past centuries, marveling at how the city had endured. The contrast between the old, stinking ditches and the new engineered tunnels became part of Paris's identity. Today, Tours of the Paris sewers remind visitors that the city's beauty rests partly on what lies beneath. To understand Paris, you must not only look up at its cathedrals, but also down into its drains. So the story of Paris's sewers is not only about waste, it is about transformation. What began as a world of filth, tolerated for centuries, became a symbol of modernity and pride. The lesson is simple but profound. Civilization is not only built in palaces and cathedrals, but in the hidden systems that keep life bearable. And perhaps the final question lingers. When future historians study our cities, will they marvel not at our monuments, but at the hidden systems beneath our feet that we take for granted today? When we think of taxes today, we imagine coins, notes, or electronic transfers. But for most of history, especially in the medieval world, ordinary people had little money. What they had was grain, sacks of wheat, rye, or barley, harvested with sweat and stored with care. And so taxes were paid not in silver, but in the very food that kept families alive. In a medieval village, cash was rare. Markets operated, yes, but most peasants lived in a barter economy. They grew what they ate, and only occasionally sold surplus. To demand money from them would have been useless. So lords, kings, and churches collected in kind, meaning in goods rather than cash. Grain was the most common, but peasants might also owe eggs, honey, or livestock. Still, grain was the backbone. Every family needed it. Every village produced it, and rulers demanded it. The feudal system was built on obligation. Peasants farmed the land, but it belonged to the lord. In return for the right to work it, they owed rents and taxes, usually measured in sacks of grain. Each autumn, after the harvest, villagers hauled their grain to the lord's granary. There, clerks weighed and measured the sacks, recording each family's dues. Sometimes the payment was a fixed share, perhaps 1/10 of the harvest, the tithe. Other times it was a set quantity, regardless of how well the year had gone. In good years, this was bearable. In bad years, when rain failed, pest struck, or war disrupted fields, paying grain taxes could mean hunger for family. The church was often the greatest collector. The tithe, literally 1/10, was owed to the local parish, filling barns that sustained priests, monks, and the poor. Some grain-fed monasteries, which in turn redistributed food to travelers and beggars. But secular rulers also demanded their share. Kings levied grain to feed armies, stock cities, or sell for revenue. In times of war, grain could be requisitioned in massive amounts, draining villages dry. For the ordinary peasant, this meant their harvest was always divided. Part for the family, part for the animals, part for seed, and a heavy portion for taxes. Survival was a constant calculation. At the center of many villages stood the tithe barn, a massive structure with thick timber beams and high roofs. Here the lord's or church's share was stored. These barns were sometimes larger than the peasant homes combined, looming as physical reminders of obligation. To deliver grain was not only an economic act, but a social ritual. Villagers stood in line, watching as their hard-earned harvest was measured and claimed. The barn doors closed on piles of grain that might have fed their families, but now belonged to others. Paying in grain meant that taxes were felt physically. A sack of wheat was heavy, carried on backs or dragged in carts. To hand it over was to feel the loss in your muscles, not just in your purse. This made taxation immediate and personal. It wasn't an abstract number in an account. It was food, bread for children, porridge for winter, gone into the Lord's storehouse. So when you think of taxes in the past, don't picture coins clinking in a coffer. Picture instead the creak of carts, the sweat of lifting sacks, the echo of footsteps in the tithe barn. For in those burdens of grain lay the survival of kingdoms and the hunger of families. And the question lingers, how did this system of grain taxation shape not only village life, but the very power of lords, kings, and churches? If Section 1 showed us the backbreaking burden of delivering sacks of grain to tithe barns, Section 2 takes us into quieter, but equally powerful world of records, transport, and administration. Because once grain left the villagers' hands, it didn't just sit in a barn. It became part of a system, one that stretched from muddy fields to royal tables. On tax days, villagers gathered with their carts, lining up outside the Lord Granary or the church tithe barn. Inside, clerks waited with tallies and wax tablets. Each delivery was weighed, measured, and recorded. The amount was scratched into tablets, later copied neatly into parchment ledgers. These records became the backbone of the Lord's wealth. A paper or parchment, reflection of the harvest. Errors, accidental or deliberate, carried weight. If a clerk undercounted, the Lord lost revenue. If he overcounted, the villagers suffered hunger. Corruption crept in easily, and villagers often suspected clerks of rounding up in the Lord's favor. Once collected, grain rarely stayed in the village. From barns, it was shipped outward. Some fed the local castle or monastery directly. Other portions were carted to cities, where they supplied markets and bakeries. Kings used grain taxes to feed armies. Long lines of carts followed soldiers on campaign, carrying sacks of flour and barley. Sometimes the grain was sold to merchants, converting it into coin for war or construction. In this way, a single peasant sack of rye might end up baked into bread for monks in a distant abbey, or boiled into porridge for soldiers hundreds of miles away. Managing this flow required meticulous bureaucracy. Granary officials counted stores, issued receipts, and inspected barns. In larger kingdoms, officials compiled annual rolls of taxes, updating what each village owed. These records still survive. In England, for example, the Domesday Book of 1086 included detailed notes on land, crops, and obligations, a monumental snapshot of taxation. Similar registers across Europe reveal how rulers turned grain into power. The system was not fair. Lords sometimes demanded more than was due, especially in lean years. Clerks could skim grain for themselves. Transporters might lose sacks along the way. Villagers often bore the brunt. If grain spoiled in storage or was stolen en route, they were still expected to deliver their share next year. Complaints and petitions survive in records, showing how commoners protested unfair treatment, though rarely with success. Grain taxation became a source of resentment, feeding into uprisings when burdens grew too heavy. Behind many peasant revolts was not only hunger, but the sight of barns filled with grain while families starved. Despite the flaws, the system worked well enough to sustain kingdoms. Grain taxes supported courts, monasteries, and armies. They allowed rulers to build roads, castles, and cathedrals. They turned village harvests into imperial power. Every sack handed over by a weary peasant was a building block of statecraft. Grain was the currency of survival, and through it, rulers transformed subsistence into authority. So when you picture medieval taxation, don't imagine neat piles of coins and treasuries. Imagine dusty ledgers filled with numbers, wagons creaking under sacks, and barns groaning with harvest. And yet, one question remains. If kingdoms fed on peasant grain, how much of their power rested on a system that could collapse with a single bad harvest? If Section 1 showed us the burden of grain payments and Section 2 traced their journey into barns and ledgers, Section 3 reveals the long-term consequences of this system. Because grain taxation was never just about food. It was about power, resentment, and change. One of the cruelest realities of grain taxation was the sight of full granaries beside hungry homes. Villagers often struggled through harsh winters, their own stores nearly empty, while barns owned by lords or churches stood stocked. The grain inside was not theirs anymore. It belonged to the system, to support nobles, armies, or clergy. This created deep resentment, especially in times of famine. For peasants, the tax barns were symbols not of order but of injustice, reminders that their labor fed others while their families went hungry. It is no coincidence that many medieval uprisings were fueled by disputes over taxes. The Jacquerie in France, 1358, the Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381, and countless smaller uprisings across Europe often tied directly to food and taxation. Grain taxes, especially in years of poor harvests, were a spark. When rulers demanded their portion regardless of scarcity, villagers saw it not as duty, but as theft. Rebellion often began with attacks on barns, mills, or records, striking at the physical symbols of the system. Thus, the multure of the miller, the tithe of the priest, and the levy of the lord all became flashpoints for violence. Over time, economies changed. By the late Middle Ages, towns and markets expanded, and coinage became more common. Rulers increasingly demanded taxes in cash rather than grain. This shift had profound effects. For peasants, it sometimes meant greater freedom. Money could be earned, saved, and paid without hauling heavy sacks. But it also tied them more closely to markets and wages, making them vulnerable to price fluctuations. For rulers, cash was more flexible than grain. It could pay mercenaries, buy luxury goods, or fund wars abroad. Grain was bulky and perishable. Money was light and portable. Slowly, the economy of grain taxation gave way to a money-based system. Even after money became dominant, the memory of grain taxes lingered. The tithe barn, with its massive beams and cavernous halls, remained a symbol of medieval obligation. In some places, they stood for centuries, long after they ceased to function. These barns, like ruins of castles, remind us of the systems that shaped daily life. They are monuments not to kings or knights, but to the quiet burden of peasants who lifted sack after sack into their shadows. The story of grain taxation reveals a truth often hidden in history, that great kingdoms and churches were built not only by armies or rulers, but by the daily sacrifices of villagers. A sack of wheat was as powerful as a sword. A tithe barn was as important as a fortress. And yet, the system's fragility was always visible. One bad harvest, one harsh winter, one revolt, and the delicate balance of obligation could crack. Grain taxation gave rulers power, but also sowed the seeds of rebellion. So when you think of medieval taxes, don't imagine coins alone. Imagine fields of wheat harvested in sweat, carried on backs, and stacked in barns where lords counted their wealth. Grain was the currency of life, heavy, perishable, and precious. And perhaps the final question is this: if our own economies rest on invisible systems of food and energy, will future generations look back on us and see the same fragility that once haunted the peasants who paid their taxes in grain? In the flickering light of a medieval night, there was no electricity, no gas lamps, no steady glow beyond the reach of the sun. Darkness fell heavy, broken only by firelight, from hearths, torches, and above all, candles. The candle was simple, humble, and taken for granted. Yet each one represented a long chain of labor. Animals slaughtered, bees tended, wax gathered, hands working patiently to shape something that would burn for only a few hours. To understand the candle's importance, you must first imagine medieval darkness. When the sun set, the world shrank. Most people went to bed, since staying awake meant burning fuel, precious wood, oil, or wax. Night was a time of danger, filled with thieves, animals, and spirits imagined in shadows. Only the wealthy could afford to fight back the dark with candles in abundance. For everyone else, light was rationed, precious, and fleeting. The cheapest and most common candles were made of tallow, rendered fat from sheep or cattle. The process was unpleasant. Butchers sold fat to candle makers, who boiled and purified it, then repeatedly dipped wicks into the melted tallow, layer by layer, until they formed usable candles. The smell was acrid, the smoke thick. Burning tallow candles filled rooms with a greasy odor, clinging to clothes and walls. Yet for peasants, they were often the only option. A tallow candle was not luxury. It was survival. A single stub could mean the difference between finishing work after sunset or sitting idle in the dark. Far rarer were beeswax candles. Unlike tallow, beeswax burned cleanly, with a sweet scent and a steady flame. It produced little smoke, making it ideal for churches, monasteries, and noble halls. But beeswax was expensive. Hives yielded limited wax, and harvesting it was delicate. For this reason, beeswax candles were often reserved for the altar, where their pure flames symbolized holiness. To light one in a peasant home was nearly unthinkable. Thus, light itself became a marker of class. The poor lived in smoke and smell, the wealthy in sweet golden glow. Because candles were costly, they were used sparingly. Families might keep one for special occasions, lighting it only for prayer, childbirth, or when urgent work demanded it. The stub of a candle was hoarded carefully, its light eked out minute by minute. Even for the wealthy, candles were an expense. Accounts from noble households detail the number of candles burned nightly, tracked as carefully as food or wine. To manage candles was to manage wealth. Candles carried more than practical value. They became symbols of devotion, purity, and memory. In churches, They burned before relics and altars, their flame seen as prayers rising upward. In funerals, candles surrounded the dead, lighting their passage into eternity. The candle's fragility, short-lived flickering, consumed as it gave, made it a perfect metaphor for human life itself. Writers and preachers alike drew on this image. We burn, we shine, we are consumed. So the next time you picture a medieval night, imagine the long journey of a candle, from the fat of an animal or the comb of a hive, through the hands of craftsmen, to the trembling light in a room where shadows press close. And the question lingers, what does it say about a world when even light itself was a privilege, rationed and divided by wealth? The candle was not just a household tool. It was also an industry, a regulated commodity, and a marker of time itself. In a world before clocks struck every hour or gas lamps lit every street, candles shaped the rhythm of life, and those who made them wielded quiet influence. For ordinary people, the day began and ended with the sun. Farmers rose with first light, worked until dusk, and rarely extended their labor into the night. But in towns where artisans and scribes worked indoors, candles stretched the day. A single stub could give a craftsman an extra hour of weaving or a clerk another page of copying. In monasteries, where prayers followed strict schedules, candles marked the canonical hours. Matins before dawn, vespers at twilight, compline at night. The flicker of flame kept the rhythm of devotion alive in the darkness. Light was not just comfort. It was order, discipline, and control over time. By the later Middle Ages, the making of candles became organized into guilds, especially in larger towns. Candle makers had strict rules. Tallow chandlers produced everyday candles, while wax chandlers specialized in the costly beeswax reserved for churches and nobles. Guild charters set standards for quality. Candles had to be a certain thickness, burn evenly, and last a predictable time. Fraudulent chandlers who mix inferior fats into beeswax risked heavy fines. In this way, light itself became regulated. To sell a candle was to participate in an industry with rules, prices, and hierarchies. Even flame was bound by law. Churches were among the greatest consumers of candles. Vast numbers burned at altars, during feast days and in long vigils. Monasteries calculated candle usage as carefully as food. The demand was so high that entire beekeeping operations were devoted to supplying wax for ecclesiastical use. In some regions, monasteries owned hives across wide estates. Their honey sold for income while the wax was reserved for the altar. For the faithful, the candle's flame was not only light but symbol. Each flicker was a prayer. Each burned stick an offering. The sheer volume of candles consumed by religion made them one of the most spiritual and expensive commodities of medieval life. Candles also shaped public order. In some towns, curfews required households to extinguish lights after a set hour, reducing the risk of fires. Candles were both blessing and danger. A single-tipped flame could burn down a street of wooden houses. Authorities also worried about gatherings by candlelight. Secret meetings, conspiracies, or heretical worship could hide in the dark. To regulate light was to regulate behavior. Thus, in ways both practical and symbolic, the control of candles was part of the control of society. For ordinary families, the cost of candles meant nights were short. A stub of tallow might burn for an hour or two, and then darkness returned. People adjusted their rhythms accordingly, sleeping in 2 shifts, waking in the night for prayer, talk, or work before returning to bed. The wealthy, meanwhile, extended their evenings with beeswax light, hosting banquets or reading long after sunset. Here, too, candles marked class, who had the right to defy the dark, and who did not. So the candle was never just a flame. It was a regulated craft, a rhythm of devotion, a marker of wealth, and even a tool of political control. And the question remains, if something as simple as light could be rationed, regulated, and divided, what does that tell us about the boundaries of power in medieval society? By the time oil lamps, gas lights, and eventually electricity lit the modern world, the humble candle might have seemed obsolete, yet its legacy burned on. For centuries, the candle had been more than a source of light. It was a symbol, a ritual object, and a metaphor that still flickers in our language and imagination today. Medieval writers often compared life itself to a candle, fragile, finite, consumed as it gave light. Preachers reminded their congregations that just as a candle burns down to nothing, so too will human life fade into dust. This symbolism carried forward. Shakespeare spoke of brief candles as metaphors for mortality. Even today, to burn the candle at both ends reminds us of the tension between time and energy. The candle outlived its practical use by becoming part of human thought. In churches, candles remained essential long after electric lights were invented. They burn in memory of the dead, in prayer for the living, and in celebration of feasts. Their flames are symbols of purity, devotion, and hope. In Jewish tradition, the Shabbat candles are lit each week, sanctifying time itself. In Christian practice, the Easter candle represents Christ's resurrection. In Buddhist temples, candles burn before statues, joining incense and flowers in devotion. Thus, the medieval candle's role as sacred flame still endures across cultures. Even in the modern home, candles never vanished. They became symbols of intimacy, used in vigils, birthdays, or moments of romance. Power outages remind us of what medieval people knew daily, how fragile and precious a small flame can feel when darkness presses in. The industrial world no longer depends on candles for survival, but their presence lingers as a link to the past, a reminder of centuries when light itself was rationed and precious. Ironically, what was once the cheapest and most unpleasant form of light, the smoky tallow candle, has transformed into a luxury. Today, beeswax and scented candles are prized items, symbols of wealth and comfort rather than bare survival. The candle has shifted from a tool of necessity to a marker of atmosphere. Where medieval peasants hoarded their stubs, we light them casually for mood, not survival. Yet the symbolic power remains. From the slaughterhouse fat of tallow to the honeycombs of bees, from the smoky peasant hut to the glowing altars of cathedrals, the medieval candle carried light across a world of shadows. It measured time, marked devotion, and shaped human imagination. Its flame is fragile, but its legacy endures, proof that even the simplest objects can illuminate entire civilizations. So the candle's journey reminds us that history is not only written in battles or kings, but in small, flickering lights. And the question lingers, if the candle, once ordinary, has burned its way into our rituals and memory, what everyday object of our own time will one day glow with the same symbolic power? When we think of medieval infrastructure, castles and cathedrals loom large. But hidden in the countryside, small bridges of stone, wood, or packed earth did something just as important. They connected villages, markets, and lives. These forgotten bridges were not grand monuments. They were simple arches or timber spans over streams and rivers. Yet they made travel possible, trade sustainable, and communities less isolated. Without them, much of daily life in medieval Europe would have been slower, riskier, and far more fragile. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of rivers, streams, and marshes. Roads were poor, often little more than muddy tracks. To cross a river without a bridge meant fording on horseback, balancing on stepping stones, or waiting for a ferry. These crossings were dangerous. Floods swept travelers away. Wagons overturned. Goods were ruined. A journey of a few miles could be delayed for days if the waters rose. A bridge, however small, transformed the landscape. It turned uncertainty into certainty, risk into routine. Who built these bridges? Often, it was not kings or lords, but local communities and religious institutions. Monasteries sometimes funded bridges as acts of charity, seeing them as service to both God and neighbor. In other cases, lords demanded labor from peasants to maintain local crossings. Some bridges were even funded by donations, with guilds or brotherhoods established solely for their construction and upkeep. To build a bridge was considered a pious act, a way of aiding not only travelers but one's own soul. The materials varied. Wooden bridges were common but required constant repair. Floods rotted beams, winter froze planks, and war burned them easily. Stone bridges lasted longer, their arches standing for centuries, but they demanded skilled masons and heavy investment. Maintenance was a constant burden. A neglected bridge quickly became useless. Communities that relied on them had to devote time, labor, and resources to keeping them safe. In this sense, bridges were living structures, as dependent on human care as on their own foundations. Bridges were not just crossings. They were meeting places. Travelers paused, merchants traded, pilgrims rested. Some even had chapels built at their centers, where priests offered blessings for safe passage. Others became spots for markets or fairs, where villages on opposite banks met to exchange goods. The bridge, then, was more than infrastructure. It was a social stage, a place where connections, both physical and human, were made. So when you picture medieval travel, don't just imagine knights on horseback or pilgrims on roads. Picture also the small bridges they crossed, humble, creaking, half-forgotten, yet vital. And the question lingers, if these forgotten bridges made everyday life possible, why we so often remember the castles above them, but not the spans beneath our feet. Every bridge came with two faces, one of charity and connection, the other of profit and control. For while some were built freely, many were tied to tolls and rites of passage. A bridge wasn't just stone over water, it was a gate, and gates could be taxed. Many lords and towns used bridges as revenue sources. To cross, travelers paid a fee, whether in coin, goods, or labor. Some tolls were modest, others were burdensome. Merchants carrying wagons of wool or grain often resented these charges, especially when multiple bridges stood along a single trade route. Complaints about excessive tolls appear in medieval charters, evidence of the constant tension between free passage and lordly profit. For the poor, tolls were not always money. Sometimes peasants were required to work on bridge maintenance as part of their feudal obligations. The bridge, in this sense, embodied both connection and exploitation. Because bridges control movement, they were also military assets. Armies fought over them, defended them, or destroyed them to halt enemies. A single bridge could decide a campaign, its narrow span forcing armies to bottleneck or turn back. Local lords understood this. To hold a bridge was to control trade, travelers, and troops. Many castles were built near important crossings, their walls looming over stone arches. Bridges were not only for commerce, they were choke points of power. Interestingly, not all bridges were taxed. Some were built by religious orders or guilds who declared them free crossings, acts of charity meant to aid pilgrims and the poor. These charitable bridges often became famous, celebrated as symbols of generosity, yet they sometimes competed with toll bridges nearby, sparking disputes between lords and clergy over who had the right to collect revenue. Even piety and profit clashed at the water's edge. Bridges also shaped local identity. Villages on opposite banks sometimes quarreled over maintenance responsibilities. Town councils argued over who collected tolls. In some places, bridges became flashpoints of rivalry, their upkeep or profit fueling feuds. At the same time, bridges could unite. Joint festivals, fairs, and markets often grew up at crossings, turning them into spaces of cooperation. The same structure that divided communities through tolls could also bring them together through commerce. So important were bridges that they appear frequently in medieval charters and legal codes. Kings granted rights to build or maintain them, often with privileges attached. Some documents exempted certain groups, like pilgrims, from tolls, while others fixed toll rates to prevent abuse. In this way, bridges became part of the legal fabric of kingdoms, woven into the language of charters, privileges, and obligations. A bridge was never just a span of stone. It was a site of law and negotiation. So the bridge was never simply a gift of stone and timber. It was a stage of power, a marketplace of tolls, a choke point of armies. Every crossing carried not just people but conflict, negotiation, and profit. And the question lingers, when a bridge can be both a blessing and a burden, does it connect people more than divides them, or the other way around? If bridges were once lifelines of medieval life, what remains of them now? Many have crumbled, their timbers rotted, their stones swallowed by rivers. Yet their legacy lingers, in ruins, in roads, in the very shape of villages that grew up around them. For many communities, the bridge was not just a crossing, but the reason for their existence. Villages grew where bridges allowed markets to flourish. Inns, taverns, and shops clustered at their ends, serving travelers who paused on their journeys. Some towns owed their prosperity entirely to a single span. When a bridge collapsed or a river shifted, villages often declined, losing the trade that had sustained them. The fate of a community was tied to the endurance of its bridge. In parts of Europe, ancient stone bridges still stand, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, wagon wheels, and hooves. Their arches rise quietly over streams, forgotten by history books, but still carrying locals from one bank to another. Each stone is a record of human passage. To walk across such a bridge today is to walk in the footprints of peasants, pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers long gone. The structure itself becomes a form of archive, holding memory in its very foundations. Bridges also entered folklore. Legends tell of bridges built by saints or even by the devil, their arches tied to bargains or miracles. In stories, bridges often symbolize thresholds, places of transition, danger, or encounter. For medieval minds, the bridge was more than physical. It was a symbol of crossing from one state to another, from one world to another. To step onto a bridge was to step into the unknown. As modern roads and larger engineering projects replaced them, many medieval bridges fell into ruin. Some were dismantled for stone, others washed away in floods. Villages moved or withered, leaving only fragments behind. Yet even in disappearance, they left marks. Old road maps trace lines that end at rivers where bridges once stood. Place names Bridgeford, Pontserrat, Bruckdorf echo their presence. The memory of the crossing endures, even if the stones do not. The true legacy of medieval bridges is not their architecture, but their function, connection. They remind us that history is not only built by kings and wars, but by the humble crossings that allowed people to trade, meet, and survive. Every forgotten bridge carried stories as surely as it carried carts. Stories of neighbors who met halfway, of armies that clashed on narrow spans, of pilgrims who crossed on their way to holy shrines.